Morning, everybody. Nice to see you. We'll see how this works, or doesn't work, as the case might be. Have you ever done a timeline of your life, if I get that right? You know, where you put down birth to now and you plot all the key events, you either write words or you use symbols, all the significant things that have happened to you. So it might be births in your families or important deaths or separations. It might be changes in your life, education or work. Could be relationships you start or stop. Might even be things that you read or really important conversations that you have. You can also, if you like, plot your feelings as your moods rise and fall over that time span of your life. When you've done that activity, you can then look at it. But what it gives you is not just a little bit of history, but a means of self-understanding, where you can think about the experiences that you have been through and how they have shaped you, how they have made you the person that you are now. When I've done that, I've found it really helpful. So I've included in our additional materials that you'll get on our website an exercise where you can do this, just some simple instructions. And I really recommend that you take the time to do it if you haven't done it before. It's a surprisingly powerful thing to do to help you in your self-understanding. So when I've done these timelines, I guess I've had a number of responses, but just to give a couple of examples. I can pinpoint a time I went on a picnic. And you might think, well, that's not incredibly important. But I went on a picnic. My family had some close family friends that we hadn't seen for quite a while. And then we caught up, I think it was just actually down at Lane Cove. And there, the boy of that family, who was the same age as me, had started going to church and he invited me. He only went for a few months and then dropped out. But in that time, I joined. And I wonder, if I'd never gone on that picnic, would I ever have gone to church? Would I ever have become a Christian? A very small event had a profound impact on my life. But I also look at things in perhaps some other ways and some negative experiences. For example, how some of my attitudes as a person were formed and how they impact me, particularly in my relationship with my mum. So in your timeline, you can even go backwards beyond your birth date to see other things that happened from the past that shaped you. My great-grandfather was an officer in the British Army in India. He was decorated by Queen Victoria herself, my family proudly tell me. But he was living in an environment with his wife where he had a very superior attitude to those that he lived amongst. And when they migrated to Australia, they brought those attitudes with them. They thought they were above everybody. They had very high expectations of life, and everyone else was just below them. And my mother was raised in that family with her grandparents and with her mother, who was shaped profoundly by that way of looking at people. And I see that with some frustration still in my mum and also in me. And it causes tension between us. What my mum didn't know until relatively recently was that her mother and the man who became her father got together before they were married and had a child, which was a great shame in their family. My mum was born out of wedlock. Well, she was going to be. But they hastily married, and my grandfather, being the man he was, forged the birth certificate. So she grew up thinking she was a year younger than she actually was. That, though, meant my grandfather was never welcomed in that family. He was beneath their social class, and he was a man not to be trusted because of what he'd done to their darling daughter. That also shaped the attitude that my own father received when he came into the family, because he didn't quite tick the boxes either. But this attitude I see quite pervasive in my family, and that's come down to me. And that's shaped my upbringing. And it's been something that I've had to wrestle with as a person to change, because it's not something I particularly like. All of those things, I guess, are just simple ways to say all of us are complex. We all have complex stories. And getting that self-understanding is incredibly helpful to us because many factors shape how we live. The question is, though, who tells the story? whose voice gets listened to, who gets to make the marks on the timeline and say this is an important event and this is not. This is someone who gives the authoritative account of life and existence, and this voice is silenced or marginalised. The other week I went to see the musical Hamilton. I must confess I'm not a lover of musicals, but I love this one. It was brilliant. It was surprisingly brilliant. It tells the story of a bloke called Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers or founding brothers of the United States of America, who in many ways has been marginalised from the history of America until fairly recently. And the musical is trying to bring back an understanding of this very complex character. He was an orphan immigrant boy who came to the States with very little, but made good because he was frankly a genius and was brilliant with words. He was driven to leave a legacy, to do something with his life. He didn't want to waste his life, or the refrain that goes through the songs, he didn't want to waste his shot, his go at life. But what Hamilton is mostly remembered for is a shot from a gun which killed him, fired in a duel by Vice President Aaron Burr. Why they got into a duel is an interesting conversation, but we won't go there. But in the story of the musical, and almost all of it is done in song, and it's quite amazing, George Washington says to him, "You have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story." And that's the tension he lives with, because things go sour for him. Who will tell his story and how will it be told? How will he be remembered? Does his life count for anything? Because his voice has been a silent one through much of history. But sitting there, and you might look at the cast and say, well, that guy there doesn't look much like George Washington. He's got the wrong colour skin, but that's the point. Because far more significant voices, I think, than Alexander Hamilton have been silenced through American history. The voices of those whose land it was before those people came, the Native Americans, and the voices of African American slaves upon whom these men got rich and prospered. Who listens to their voice? And I think it's beyond being ironic that one of these founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, could write these words in his drafting of the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights," if I can get that word out, "that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Jefferson owned more than 600 slaves on his property at Monticello, including a young girl, Sally Hemings, with whom he had a sexual relationship and fathered at least 6 children. He kept her in a secret place in Monticello. His wife was aware of this. He started that relationship, he was in his mid-40s, she was maybe 13 or 14. And you wonder what choice she had in that arrangement. How could this man justify that behaviour? It's a complex story. Treating a person as property, using them, is a powerful thing that people do justify. And how that voice was not listened to continues to shape American history today, doesn't it? Those tensions, those elements, that unresolved story shapes the very fabric of daily life for American people. That also shaped the fabric of daily life for the history of the people of Israel. For they also had a story of slavery, of oppression, of abuse. And that was important for them to see in their own timeline because of what it would do for them. The book of Exodus is in many ways a timeline, a history, showing their self-understanding of the key markers of things which happened to them that made them the people that they are. This book was compiled by lots of sources being brought together. Some things that Moses and others had wrote, some ancient songs that they continue to sing, some oral traditions that were passed down for a millennia before this book was put together on papyrus. It was a theological telling, so it's not a newspaper article, it's not dealing with events how we might report them, but it was giving an understanding, an interpretation of these events. So we mustn't get hung up on things being too literal. That's not the importance. It's the meaning of these things which was important for the writer of Exodus. When is this book written? Well, it's written at another time in Israel's life when they are again under the oppression of a foreign nation, of a foreign ruler. They are in exile in Babylon. Their nation has been destroyed. Everything is in turmoil. And they need to know again, who are we? What is our identity? Where is God in all of this? Where are we going? What will be our legacy? Is it all for nothing? Or is there purpose and plan in this? And so the writer goes back to the origins to tell the story of who they are of a previous time of oppression and abuse, because that will direct them in how they respond in the present. They are longing for something better. Many of us are longing for something better. And we wonder, where is our life going? What will be the tale that is told, and who will tell it when our life is finished? Today I just want to give a brief introduction. I don't want to talk too long, just that will help shape our understanding as we begin this book together. When I went to see Hamilton, I'd read some American history, including some good books on this period, and so I had a better understanding of things that they were singing about. Oh, that's what that means. If you don't, you sort of miss quite a bit. I'm no historian, but I had an idea. It's the same with the book of Exodus. If we have some background, it will help us appreciate the details as we go. So I'm not going to say too much today, but again, if you go to our website, there are some materials there that you in your own time can use to familiarise yourself with the history. So I don't want to rehearse this. I don't want it to be a lecture. It's a sermon. You can do that in your own time if you go there. Is that okay? Instead, I want to just jump into this first chapter, because it opens with a people who are oppressed, a people who are slaves, a people in captivity. And we want to put our minds into the feeling of those people as we read their story, because we are going to hear voices that are usually silenced. The story starts in a really strange way. We don't pick this up in our English translation, but the Hebrew Bible of Exodus starts with the word and. Now, and is not a good way to start a sentence, much less a story. And. What's going on? If you look at Leviticus and Numbers, they also start with the same word, and. And. Because Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, and also Deuteronomy, are all telling one story. And we need to understand what's happening in Exodus in light of what has already been told in Genesis. It starts, and these are the names. And again, you might think, well, that's a really weird way to start a story, listing people's names. But these names are important. These are the important people in their history that tell them who they are and where they've come from. Our word Exodus is from a Greek word. It's just transliterated from chapter 19. You'll find this word. It just means departure, way out, the way out of a situation. Jewish people call this book Names. It's about names. It's about people. It's about their story. And chapter 1, verse 1 of Exodus quotes directly Genesis 46:8, where this very same list of names is given for the people who are living in Egypt. And it jumps 400 years later, and this is what happened next. Genesis, the book ends this way in chapter 50. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. The story of Exodus is the story of how God brought these names out of Egypt into the promised land. What he did with them those 400 years later. How he made relationship with them. We'll look at this word covenant a little bit later. And how his presence was with them, which takes up about half of the book that we often don't worry about. But we'll see why that's important a bit later. God heard the cries of the slaves, the cries of the marginalised and oppressed, and so he acted to do something. He remembers their story. These 70 people had grown into a great nation. The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. The word literally is swarm. The word swarm will be used of the frogs that swarm across the land in the plagues. They were so numerous. Again, this takes us back to Genesis, the blessing that God called upon people to be fruitful and multiply. First to Adam in chapter 1, then to Noah as humanity starts again in chapter 9, and then particularly to Abraham, where God promised in chapters 13 and 15 that your descendants will be so innumerable that it's like stars in the sky or sand on the seashore. You just can't count them. This is God's blessing. But that blessing became a problem for the people of Egypt. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That doesn't mean he'd forgotten, he didn't know his own history. It means he had no regard for, no respect towards, no obligation to do anything. Of course he knew them, that was the problem. He knew who these people were and he didn't like them. What's he going to do about them? Pharaoh said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." He feels threatened. He feels threatened by the foreigner, the one who is different and doing well. We've heard similar stories in Australia, haven't we? Not so many years ago, we are being swamped by Asians. And then the story became they're taking all our jobs and taking over. And then it became the Muslims. They'll bring their culture and their customs and we will lose our way of life. And populist voices raise all these fears and plays upon people's prejudice and fear of difference. This is what Pharaoh does. It's an old strategy that seems to work well. Blame the refugee. Blame the person in need. Blame the person who does well by working hard when you are not doing so well. Everything is based on a what if. What if this happens? What if that happens, he says. And so he breeds fear and suspicion and distrust and turns one segment of the population against another. From verse 11 onwards, he instigates systemic oppression. And again, we see this in many countries around the world. When one group of people is treated differently from another, they are forced into hard labour. But it doesn't work so well. It's interesting in verse 11, where the writer, I haven't got the verse up there, speaks about the oppression that the Israelites experienced, because that same word is used in a funny story in Genesis that might actually help us understand what is happening and why these events take place. Do you know the story of Hagar? Abraham married Sarah and they couldn't have children. Sarah had a slave, an Egyptian slave. Her name was Hagar. She said, "Abraham, you have her. We want children. You use her." Then she did have a child, Ishmael. And Sarah got incredibly jealous. And the word that we read in Exodus of the oppression of Pharaoh is the exact word used of how Sarah treats Hagar. She deals meanly and oppresses her. Isn't it interesting? What's the writer saying here? Abraham kicks Hagar and her son Ishmael out, and they walk into the wilderness and are about to die, and God listens to their cry and brings them water to sustain them. bringing these two stories together. What is the writer saying? What is the writer teaching us about the character of God? Because Moses will say in the book of Deuteronomy, God loves the foreigner in your midst. We must care for, clothe, and feed the foreigner, because this is what God is like. This is what we have learnt from our slavery in Egypt. You can read that in Deuteronomy if you like. Life is complex, isn't it? And I love it how the Bible is like that. It doesn't make goodies and baddies. Here's the great patriarch Abraham behaving very poorly. The mother of the nation, not so nice. A bit like Thomas Jefferson. People are complex. We are complex. And that's what the writer's getting us to think about. How do I see this operating in my own life? The plan doesn't work, so here is the next move by Pharaoh. He turns to infanticide. The king of Egypt said to the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. The whole book of Exodus, Pharaoh's never named. We're never told which Pharaoh it is. We can only guess. We don't know. But here, these two women are named. These people that are normally written out of big histories get names. I don't think it's their actual names. The names mean beauty and splendour in Hebrew. So I don't think that's actually what they were called. They could have been. But it's more likely that the writer is saying, this is what we think of as beauty and splendour, behaving in this way. These are the sorts of people we need to remember. This Pharaoh guy, he comes and goes. We don't worry about him. We don't even need to know his name. This is who we are. Focus on these women. These are characters to learn from. Whether these were their real names or not, I guess we can think they had real feelings. Can you imagine your daily job, frightening job I think, but exhilarating job, is to help a woman give birth? I've been at a few births. It's quite an amazing experience to have. What a job to have. And then to be told, when you see this child coming out, and if it's a boy, you must kill it. What emotions would you have if you were told that? Maybe in your workplace you've been encouraged to compromise or do something not quite upright. I doubt many of us have been asked to kill somebody in our workplace. How will they respond? And you'd think, well, of course they'll just say no, but really? What will the consequences be for them? And again, history tells us that many people will just comply. Many people will just say, well, there's nothing I can do. This is the way of the Third Reich and we've just got to follow along. Good people can do bad things. And these women could have acted in that way. What will they do? What will these two women feel and do as they think about their role in history? The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Here's the first mention of God in the story, if you've read from verse 1. And what does the presence of God do? It incites civil disobedience. They refuse to comply, which is interesting. They show bravery and also ingenuity in how they respond. It's a bit soft how this is translated. They just didn't let the boys live. They helped them to thrive, is what the Hebrew says. And they spin an ingenious tale. They say, well, these Hebrews are a bit different from the Egyptians. One way of reading it is saying they're a bit like wild animals. They just drop their young and keep running. Maybe that's not a nice thing to say, but maybe it's playing to Pharaoh's prejudices. Or maybe they know he's just a dumb blokey bloke that would believe such a stupid story. Because clearly this isn't reality. If Hebrew women have their children like that, they don't need midwives. Their job's over. They do need midwives because they're normal women. But he's, at least in the story, so stupid as to believe this invented justification. But what's the outcome of that story? God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And so we get to state-sanctioned genocide. This is the story of Israel. This is what has shaped us. What will happen next? It didn't work to push them harder with hard labour. It didn't work to go through the midwives. Now he's raised up the whole populace to wipe out these people, throw them all in the river and drown them. What will happen? We have to come back next week, because that's chapter 2. I want to finish by asking, how do we leave this story today? What do we do with this bit of story? I think the writer of Exodus, in fact the whole First Testament, uses the story of the oppression in Egypt over and over, not to lay blame, not to induce sympathy, but to teach Israel its ethics. This is what you went through. Therefore, you need to identify with those going through similar things. This is what you learn through this experience. Therefore, this is your identity as people who care for the oppressed and the marginalised. And the prophets always use this story to teach that reality. This is who you are. This is what should be the consequence of this experience in how you live. This is your destiny. Your role is to be my agents in caring for people. This is the legacy you are to leave. Far more important than creating the United States of America, Mr. Hamilton. But it teaches us something also about sin and redemption. Why is Israel in Egypt? Well, they went there in response, in obedience to the command of God to go there so they would survive in a time of famine. That's why Joseph's brothers followed him across. They'd done nothing wrong to be in this situation. Sin is much bigger than just personal responsibility. Therefore, God's redemption out of sin isn't just forgiving personal sins against him, it's changing life. Redemption is much bigger. It includes that. Includes dealing with our sin and being put right with God. But it's about all of life, and that's what Exodus is going to teach us. These things matter to God. How we live, how we treat people, how people are treated. This is the story that he wants us to be shaped by. This is to be our part in this story. This week we hosted a Refugee Week event, just with some local community organisations, came here and we had some lunch and had a couple of speakers. One guy from Syria spoke about his life, very prosperous life in Syria up until 2011 when things changed. Just things went horribly wrong. Murders, losing his livelihood, and he fled. And you think, this guy did nothing wrong, and this came upon him. What does God do? What do we do in a world like that? That's the Exodus story. These people had done nothing wrong, but look at how they were treated. What will God do? How does God redeem? That shapes our thinking about our activity and agency in the world. What are we doing about this? Because the last thing I want us to think about is what example do we find? I think we find a great example in these two women. These are people we are to emulate. They show courage, they show ingenuity in acting. They regard God, they fear God, and so at their own risk to themselves, they do something to make a difference in the world. They don't know how the story's going to end up. They don't know about Moses and what's going to happen. They just know this is the reality today and I need to do something about it. And this is what we are called to do, to learn the example of these two wonderful women. But it's complex to know what to do, isn't it? What do we do about this messy world? That's why we need each other. That's why we need to read this story together and think, okay, what are the implications for us? How do I apply that in my situation, in my life, in my circle of influence? That's why we meet with each other through the week to talk about this. The sermon will give you some grounding. What we're hoping you will do is then use resources that we are giving you to extend that into action. So if you're not part of one already, join a life group where we share life, do life together, and apply the same stuff. So all of our life groups will be studying what we do on the Sunday before. So I'd encourage you to do that. You just join up via the website and you can get in part of one of those. Final thing I guess I want to say before I finish, and hopefully it's not been too long, is just to mention this issue of trauma. Imagine being those people going through that. Imagine watching your baby son thrown into a river. You've been through 9 months of expectation, and that's what comes. Trauma. How do you ever recover from that? I think we need to be alert that many of us have been through trauma. Some of us might have something that's happened to us in our past that's buried deep within us and that we maybe don't even understand, but which shapes us. It's one of those events in our lifespan, and something might happen and it just triggers, and we do it all over again. We see that in oppressed peoples who are slaves today. We'll look at modern slavery in a few weeks' time. We see it in our own colonised people, our Indigenous population, who from one generation to the next go on with trauma. They're shaped by things that happened before they were even born. We see it in people who are abused, sexually abused, physically abused, domestic violence, those things which shape us in traumatic ways. And I guess we need to be alert to that in ourselves, to know our own story. If we don't really see the impact of that, there's nothing much we can do about it. To be compassionate to others who have been through such things, and to work as agents of healing where that is possible. But I think that's only possible when we know our own story first, to deal with our own issues. Otherwise, trying to help others will be distorted and be counterproductive. What is our legacy? What song will be sung about us? I don't imagine that they're going to write a musical about me, but I do believe that God knows my story and that he's happy to sing it with the saints in glory. And that's the destiny that he wants for all of us. That's the longing that he wants fulfilled. Jesus said, "Come to me, I want to give you life and life to the full. I want you to make a difference." And that's what we can have. Not easily. It's a complicated story, as we'll see as we go through Exodus. But that's what God is calling us to. And so the invitation is to act, to be like these two women. Don't just, okay, let it roll by. Do something about it. Let me pray. Lord, as we begin this series in what is really a foundational book for understanding your perspective on life and who you wish us to be, we pray that you would guide us as we spend time together reading and thinking and discussing, that we would learn the things that you want to teach us, so that we would be shaped, that Exodus would become part of our life history and determine who we are and the destiny that we possess. We have that longing, and so we pray that you would fulfill it. In Jesus' name, amen.